My rich parents scheduled strangers to tour my beach condo like it was already sold. And then the county record showed a quitclaim deed from me signed yesterday. And then my stomach dropped because my grandpa deeded it to me before he died. And then I realized someone forged my name to steal it back. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. The realtor didn't knock like a normal person. He knocked like somebody who already owned the air in front of my door. 3 fast taps, confident, and then that little pause where you can hear a group behind him shifting their weight like they're lining up for a ride at an amusement park. And when I opened the door, the first thing that hit me wasn't even his face. It was the smell. Ocean salt mixed with sunscreen and expensive perfume. And then I saw them, the buyers, a man in linen pants, with a watch that looked like it cost more than my car, a woman hiding behind oversized sunglasses like the drama was part of her weekend plans, another couple holding coffee cups like they were here for an open house comedy special, and the realtor smiled at me with that shiny, practiced grin that says, "I've done this 1,000 times and you're just another obstacle," and he goes, "Hi, private showing, we're right on time." And for a second my brain didn't even process the words because my eyes were locked on the folder in his hand, glossy, professional, and right there on the cover was the exterior photo of my condo printed like it already belonged to someone else. And I didn't step back, I didn't get polite, I didn't get loud either. I just held the door and said, "You're at the wrong unit." And he didn't even blink. He just tilted his head like I was the one confused and said, "No, this is the address. We're scheduled." And that word "scheduled" did something to my stomach, like someone poured cold water down my spine, because I knew exactly who had used that word like a weapon, and I asked him, calm on purpose, who scheduled it, and he hesitated just a fraction. And then he glanced at his phone like he needed permission from his script, and he said, "Ethan and Celeste Rowe, they're the sellers." And I swear to you, my body went still, not frozen, not panicking, just still. Because when you grow up with parents like mine, you learn early that the moment you show emotion is the moment they start steering the room, and I looked past him at those strangers again, and I could see it in the sunglasses lady's posture. She wanted a show, and the linen pants guy looked annoyed like I was delaying his beach lunch. And I said, "They're not the sellers," and the realtor's smile tightened in that way where he stays polite but his patience gets sharp, and he goes, "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. The county record shows their ownership." And that right there was the first real punch. Because 2 weeks earlier, my grandpa's attorney slid a deed across a conference table, plain paper, boring fonts, deadly serious, and he said, "Your grandfather signed this before he passed. It's recorded, it's yours." And I remember my hands shaking when I held it, not because I was greedy, not because I was fantasizing about a luxury life, but because it was the first thing my grandpa ever gave me that my parents couldn't twist into a family obligation, a beach condo in a small coastal town where the mornings smelled like seagrass and the nights sounded like waves hitting the dark. And my grandpa loved that place because it was quiet, and he deeded it to me quietly too. No family announcement, no "let's all talk about it." Just paperwork done properly and recorded properly. And the moment my parents found out, they didn't scream, they didn't threaten, they smiled. And if you've ever dealt with a controlling parent, you know the smile is worse than yelling. Because yelling is honest, and a smile is strategy. My mother, Celeste, did that soft, indulgent smile like, "Oh, sweetie, you think you're a person now." And my father, Ethan, patted my shoulder like I was 5 years old and said, "Well, aren't you lucky?" And then he added, "Don't worry, we'll handle taxes and upkeep. You won't even have to think about it." And it sounded generous to anyone who doesn't speak manipulation fluently, but to me it sounded like a claim, like he was planting a flag in my life. And I didn't argue back then because arguing is a sport in my family, and I stopped playing years ago. I just kept the place tidy on weekends, changed the sheets, opened the windows, let the salty air rinse the stress out of my lungs, and I didn't give them anything to grab until that knock. And now here we were with strangers staring at me like I was a dramatic tenant and not the legal owner. And the realtor shifted his weight, still smiling, still expecting me to step aside, and I asked, "How did you get inside the building?" And he glanced toward the lobby door and said, "They gave us the access code. There's a key in a lockbox." And I felt this hot-cold mix in my chest because I hadn't put a lockbox on anything, and only a handful of people ever had keys. And yes, my parents had asked for one just in case, because my father says just in case the way other people say hello. It means I want control, without saying I want control. And I stepped out into the hallway and closed my door behind me, not slamming it, just closing it with quiet finality, and the realtor blinked like he was surprised I didn't melt down for the entertainment of his clients. And I said, "Show me the paperwork." And he opened the folder and angled it toward me like he was doing me a favor, and I didn't take it. I just read the top page. Listing agreement. Sellers listed as Ethan Rowe and Celeste Rowe. Signatures right there, clean and confident, like they had every right in the world. And I asked, "Where's my name?" And his smile finally cracked, just a little, and he said, "They told me you were staying here temporarily." And that word temporarily hit like an old bruise, because my mother uses that word for anything that isn't under her control. Your job is temporary, your feelings are temporary, your boundaries are temporary. And I said, slow and clear, "They're not the owners." And now the realtor's professionalism started turning into irritation because the script wasn't working, and he goes, "Ma'am, we pulled the public record. The county shows ownership." And right then I knew there were only two possibilities. Either the record was wrong or somebody changed it, and my parents don't do wrong. They do changed. And I looked again at the strangers behind him, and Sunglasses Lady's mouth was slightly open like she'd found her favorite scene. And I decided she wasn't getting one more second of me. So I said, "No showing today, you need to leave." And the realtor's jaw tightened and he tried to flex authority. "You can't obstruct a legal sale." And I said, "Watch me." And I pulled out my phone, not to call my parents, because you don't call the arsonist to ask why the house is on fire. You call the people who document the fire. And I took a photo of the listing page with my parents' names and signatures. Then I took a photo of the lockbox hanging like a parasite near the entrance, and the realtor snapped, "You can't take photos of my clients." And I said, "I'm not. I'm taking photos of my property being marketed without my consent." And that shifted the energy, because suddenly the coffee cup couple looked less amused. And the realtor herded them back down the hall muttering about miscommunication. And when they were gone, I stood in the quiet and listened to my own breathing. And I could feel the old instinct rise. The one that says, maybe you should be nice. Maybe you should smooth it over, because that's the role they trained you for. The peacekeeper, the problem solver, the one who doesn't embarrass the family. And then I remembered my grandpa's hands, rough and warm. The way he used to look at me when my parents were talking over me at dinner like I wasn't there, and he'd give me that tiny nod that said, "I see you." And I made a choice right there in the hallway. I wasn't going to fight my parents with emotion. I was going to fight them with the system, because the system doesn't care about their smiles, it cares about records. So I grabbed my keys, drove straight to the county records office, and it was exactly what you'd expect. Fluorescent lights, scuffed counters, faded signs, that stale air that smells like paper and patience. And I pulled a number from the kiosk and waited with my knee bouncing like a nervous metronome. And while I waited, my phone buzzed with a text from my mom, "Celeste, why are you making a scene? The realtor said you humiliated us." And I stared at it, and I almost laughed, because that's her favorite trick. She'll punch you and then accuse you of bleeding too loudly. And I didn't reply, because replying gives her something to twist. And when it was my turn, I slid my deed copy across the counter, and I said, "I need the title record for this condo. I need to see the current owner on the official record." And the clerk, older woman, tired eyes, no interest in my family drama, typed the parcel number. Click, pause, click, and then she stopped moving like her brain hit a wall, and she leaned closer to the screen, and I watched her eyes narrow. And then she looked up at me with the kind of careful face people use right before they say something that could change your whole day. And she said, "Ma'am, can you tell me why your name is in the chain of title?" And my stomach dropped, and I said, "Because my grandfather deeded it to me." And she nodded slowly, like, "Yes, that part one. See." And then she swallowed and said, "But the current owner is listed as..." And she didn't even finish the sentence out loud at first. She just turned the monitor slightly, and I saw it. The line that made my skin go tight. A quitclaim deed recorded yesterday showing a transfer from me to my parents. And my mouth went dry, and I said, "I never signed anything." And she said, "I'm not saying you did. I'm saying what the record shows." And right then the world got very simple, because when someone forges your name. It's not just theft, it's a message. It says, you don't own anything in this family, not even your own signature, and before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something for me real quick, because I want to know who I'm talking to right now. Where are you watching from? What city, what state, what country? Drop it in the comments. Because if you've ever had family try to control you with money, property, guilt, or what will people think, I want you to see you're not alone, and I want your story sitting right next to mine where everybody can read it. And while you're typing that, let me tell you the part that made my hands go steady instead of shaky. The clerk called her supervisor, and the supervisor came out with that no-nonsense walk, badge clipped to her cardigan, eyes sharp, and she said, "Tell me what's going on." And I kept it clean, no childhood backstory, no therapy language, just the sequence. My grandfather deeded it to me. His deed is recorded. A forged deed from me to my parents was recorded yesterday. A realtor showed up with buyers today, and I need the image pulled. And the supervisor nodded once like she'd heard the song before, and she clicked through her system and said, "Let's pull the recorded image." And the printer behind the counter started humming, and pages slid out, and she laid them on the counter like evidence, and there it was. My name typed at the top as grantor, my parents' names as grantees, the legal description of the condo, and then my signature at the bottom, and it was close enough to fool someone who wanted to be fooled. The same loops, the same slant, but it wasn't mine. It was too smooth, too confident, like someone tracing, and I pointed at it and said, "That is forged." And the supervisor didn't gasp or clutch pearls. She just nodded and tapped the notary block and said, "Remote online notarization." And that phrase matters because remote notarization usually leaves a digital trail, a video, an audit log, timestamps, and that's where people like my parents get sloppy because they think money buys invisibility. And the supervisor said, "This was submitted by e-recording, not walked in." And she clicked again, and her face tightened just slightly, and she turned the screen enough for me to see the submitter details, a title company account, and a contact phone number tied to the submission. And even before she said anything out loud, my gut knew what I was about to see. Because my parents always hide behind professionals. They outsourced the dirty work to clean letterheads, and the supervisor asked, "Do you want to place a fraud alert hold on this parcel?" And I said, "Yes, right now." And she slid me a sworn statement form. I filled it out with steady hands, name, address, parcel, statement that I did not execute the deed and believe it's fraudulent. And when I signed, she watched my real signature and compared it to the fake one, and the difference was immediate. And she clicked, and a red banner popped up on the record, "Fraud alert, recording hold active." And that red banner felt like the first real lock on my front door. Not because it fixed everything, but because it forced the system to look twice. And then my phone buzzed again, and it was another text from my mom, and this time she didn't even pretend to be worried about me. She wrote, "Stop making this hard. Your sister needs this." And I stared at that line, and I felt something in me turn cold and clear, because there it was, the real motive, not taxes, not upkeep, not liability. The same old family math. My sister's wants are emergencies. My needs are inconveniences. And I didn't reply. I looked back at the supervisor and said, "Print the submission log, everything tied to that deed." And she did. And while the printer hummed, she added, almost casually, "There is another submission pending." And my stomach clenched. "What kind?" I asked, and she said, "It's not a deed. It's a mortgage instrument, a deed of trust." And that's when it clicked fully. They weren't just trying to steal the condo, they were trying to monetize it fast, borrow against it, maybe even saddle the debt onto me. And I heard my own voice say, calm like a knife, "They're trying to take a loan in my name today." And the supervisor's eyes stayed on the screen, and she said, "Yes." And in that moment, I didn't feel panic, I felt purpose. Because now I wasn't just blocking a sale, I was interrupting an active fraud attempt, and I was about to find out exactly who inside their little professional network helped them press send. And that's where the story gets ugly in a way you can't unsee, because the next thing on that screen wasn't my parents' names at all. It was the name of the authorized filer on the account, and I recognized it instantly. And if you think betrayal hurts when it's strangers, wait until you see what it looks like when it wears your sister's name like a mask, because the next step I took wasn't emotional, it was surgical, and it forced my parents to show their hand in public where they couldn't smile their way out. The supervisor's cursor hovered over that pending mortgage submission like it was a live grenade, and she said it again, slower this time. "It's a deed of trust." And the way she said it wasn't dramatic, it was factual. Like, she'd seen this exact scam 100 times but still hated it every single time. and my throat went cold because a deed of trust is not a cute paperwork mistake. It's how someone takes out a loan against property, and if they do it in your name, you don't just lose a condo. You inherit a financial disease that spreads into your credit, your job, your future rentals, your ability to breathe without checking your mailbox like it's a threat. And I leaned in closer and asked, "Who is listed as the borrower?" And the supervisor clicked into the queue, scrolled, and her jaw tightened in a way that told me the answer was going to make me want to break something, and she said, "The borrower is you." And for a half second, I just stared because this is the part controlling. Families love. They don't just steal what you own, they try to make you carry the weight of their theft so you're too exhausted to fight. Like they're not just taking your beach condo, they're trying to staple debt to your name and call it your responsibility, and I heard myself exhale, slow, controlled, and I said, "So they're trying to sell it and borrow against it at the same time." And the supervisor didn't even look surprised. She nodded once like, "Yes, welcome to rich people crime. It's just paperwork with better fonts." And I asked, "Can you show me the submitter details?" And she clicked again and turned the monitor just enough so I could see the line that matters, the line that tells you who pressed send, and the submitter was my dad's name or my mom's name because they're not stupid enough to put their own fingerprints on the knife. It was the title company account, and beneath it the authorized filer name. And when the supervisor read it out loud, my stomach dropped in. Slow motion. Authorized filer. Isla Rowe. And Isla is my sister. And listen, I need you to understand the kind of silence that happens in your body when your sister's name shows up on a fraud log, because it's not just betrayal, it's confusion, because your brain starts doing that thing where it tries to protect the last piece of family you haven't fully grieved yet, and it whispers, maybe she didn't know, maybe she's being used, maybe it's a misunderstanding, and then another voice, the honest one, says, or maybe she's been in on it the whole time. And I didn't let either voice drive. I stayed on facts, because facts don't gaslight you. And I said, "Print everything." And the supervisor nodded like she'd been waiting for me to say the magic words. And the printer started humming again, pages sliding out with timestamps, routing trails, submitter IDs, and the little notes the system keeps that people don't realize exist. And while she was printing, I pulled out my phone and called the building manager, because if you've ever dealt with property fraud, you learn fast that you don't just win in court. You win at doors, codes, and keys, and the building manager answered with that tired voice like he'd rather be anywhere else. Seaside Villas Management. And I said, "This is Brook Row, Unit 9B. Change the access code immediately and remove any lockbox that was placed. I'm reporting a fraudulent deed, and unauthorized entry is happening today." And he started to give me that default script. "We can't change codes without board approval," and I cut it off calmly, not rude, just firm. "You can change codes when there's an active fraud hold at county records and law enforcement is involved. If you don't, you're knowingly allowing unauthorized access." And there was a pause. And then his tone changed, because people always get serious when you mention records and law enforcement, not feelings, and he said, "Email me whatever you have." And I took a photo of the fraud hold confirmation the supervisor had printed and emailed it right there at the counter with one sentence, short and untwistable. "Fraud alert hold active. Unauthorized showings attempted. Change code and remove lockbox immediately." And within a minute he replied, "Code will be changed, lockbox removed, security notified." And that was my first win of the day, not because it ended the fight, but because it closed a door my parents thought they owned. And right then my phone buzzed again. And it was my mom, Celeste, and she texted, "Why are you humiliating us? The realtor said you made a scene." And I stared at the message, and I almost laughed because it was so on brand. She commits the crime and then scolds you for reacting to the crime like reaction is the real sin. And I didn't answer, because any reply becomes fuel, and I kept my eyes on the printouts. And the supervisor slid the submission log toward me and said, "If you want an officer to see the record while it's on screen, the sheriff's substation is in this building." And I nodded and walked over there with my papers held flat against my ribs like armor, and the deputy behind the desk looked up and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I need to report a forged deed and attempted mortgage fraud, and it's happening today." And his eyebrows lifted, not shocked, more like, "Okay, this is real." And he asked for my name and property address, and then he said, "Tell me what happened." And I didn't start with my parents being controlling. I didn't start with my sister being favored, because that's the trap. That's how these things get dismissed as family drama. I started with the timeline. My grandfather deeded me a condo. Deed recorded. Yesterday, a quitclaim deed was recorded showing transfer from me to my parents. I did not sign it. Today, a realtor showed up with buyers using building access code and a key my parents provided. County records confirmed the forged deed and placed a fraud hold, and a deed of trust was submitted minutes ago listing me as borrower. And the deputy held up a hand and said, "Slow down." But his tone wasn't annoyed, it was focused, and he asked, "Do you have documentation?" And I slid everything across: deed copy, fraud hold confirmation, submission logs, forged deed image, and he read it in silence and tapped the notary block and said, "Remote online notarization." And when he said it, I felt a weird little spark of relief, because remote notarization usually leaves a trail, and trails are how you drag liars into daylight. And I asked, "Is there a video record?" And he nodded, usually yes, and an audit log. And then he said something that made my chest tighten. "A police report doesn't automatically stop a closing. You need an attorney to notify the title company and freeze the file." And I said, "I'm doing that next." And while he typed the report, my phone buzzed again. And this time it was Isla, my sister, texting. "Mom says you're freaking out. Over the condo, what's going on?" And her message didn't sound like a mastermind. It sounded like someone being used. And that's the part that makes you nauseous, because if she's innocent, then my parents just weaponized her identity like a costume. And if she's guilty, then she's been smiling in my face while loading the gun. And I replied with one line, factual and sharp. "Someone recorded a forged deed for me to them yesterday and attempted a loan in my name today. I'm with the sheriff at county records. Do not sign anything." And the 3 dots appeared and disappeared, and then she replied, "What? I didn't sign anything. Dad said it was paperwork to help you with taxes." And when I showed the deputy, he narrowed his eyes and said quietly, "That's your cover story." And he wasn't saying my sister did it. He was saying your parents built a narrative in advance. And the deputy printed a case number and slid it toward me and said, "We're going back to records. I want to see the fraud hold banner and the pending deed of trust entry." And we walked back across the lobby together. And he didn't stride like a movie cop. He walked like a man who knows paperwork is a weapon. And the supervisor saw his uniform, and her posture changed instantly. Like she was relieved authority was now standing in the room, and she turned the screen and showed him the red banner. "Fraud alert recording hold active." And the deputy leaned in and read the pending deed of trust entry. And then his gaze stopped, and he said slowly, "The borrower is Brooke Rowe." And the supervisor said under her breath, "They weren't just trying to sell it. They were trying to saddle her with the debt." And the deputy looked at me and said, "If they managed to record this elsewhere, you could be fighting a lien you never agreed to." And I kept my voice steady. "What do we do right now?" And he pointed at the submitter line and said, "Call the title company on speaker. Let them hear there's a case number and an active fraud hold." And I dialed, and a woman answered with that bright customer service voice, "Seabright Title. This is Kendra." And I said, "My name is Brooke Rowe. I'm calling about an e-recording submission tied to parcel number." And I read the parcel number directly off the page because precision matters. There's a fraudulent deed of trust being submitted listing me as borrower. County records has a fraud hold active, and a deputy is standing here with me. I have a case number. And there was a pause so clean I could hear the fluorescent hum, and Kendra's brightness dropped like a curtain. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." And the deputy leaned in and said, "Deputy Miles, County Sheriff, we're looking at your submission in the county queue. The hold is active." And suddenly Kendra wasn't bright anymore. She was careful. One moment, and I heard muffled voices in the background saying words like fraud hold and borrower and stop. And then a new voice came on, calm and sharp. "This is Angela, compliance manager. Tell me exactly what's happening." And I repeated the facts short and clean. And Angela didn't interrupt once. And then she asked, "Who is the authorized filer on the account?" And I said, "It shows Isla Rowe." And I added, "I do not have proof she did it. My parents could be using her." And Angela said, "Understood. We are freezing the file internally and preserving the remote notarization audit trail, the video session, and IP logs." And when she said IP logs, I almost smiled because IP logs don't care about family loyalty. And I asked, "Is there an active escrow?" And Angela paused just long enough to confirm what she was about to drop on me. "Yes, there is an active escrow file, and there was a signing window scheduled." And my pulse hit my throat. "How soon?" And she said, Today, this afternoon. And that right there is the part one want you to sit with. While I was standing at my front door with strangers and a realtor, my parents were trying to shove a closing through the system fast enough that even if I screamed later, it wouldn't matter. Because once a deed is recorded and money moves, you don't just undo it with a complaint. You undo it with court orders and months of your life. And Angela said, "We are placing an immediate stop, but I need a written dispute email with the case number and fraud hold confirmation." And I sent it right there. Case number, deed copy, fraud hold, forged deed image, one sentence. I dispute and deny executing any deed or loan documents. This is fraud. And the deputy watched me hit send and nodded once and said, "Good." And I thought, okay, we're closing the gates. And then my phone buzzed again, and my mom sent a photo message, and it was a picture of my condo door with a brand new lock installed, shiny metal, smug and bright against my old paint, and under it she wrote, "We had to secure it. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And I felt my jaw tighten because that wasn't just fraud anymore. That was intimidation wrapped in fake concern. And I showed the deputy and he said, "That's unlawful self-help, and it's evidence of intent." And the supervisor's desk phone rang and she listened for 2 seconds, and then her eyes widened and she looked straight at me and said, "A man is at the front desk asking for you by name, says he's your agent, and he has corrections for the record." And the deputy's posture changed instantly. "Name?" he asked, and the supervisor swallowed and said, "Ethan Rowe." And my stomach didn't even drop this time because it was already on the floor. And here's my question to you before I tell you what happened in that lobby. If your parents forged your name, tried to borrow money in your name, and then changed your lock like they owned you, would you still be trying to handle it privately? Or would you go scorched earth with the system the way I did? Because what happened next wasn't a screaming match. It was worse for them. It was calm, public, and recorded. And when my father realized he couldn't charm his way out of a fraud hold with a manila envelope and a smile, his mask slipped just long enough for everyone in that building to see the real man underneath. Ethan Rowe was standing at the front desk like he owned the building, like he owned air, like he owned me, shoulders back, chin lifted, that same calm rich man face he uses when he's about to lie and expects people to thank him for it. And he held a manila envelope like it was a magic wand, like paper can erase what a system already logged. And when he saw me, he smiled wide, the kind of smile that says, "There you are, my little problem child." And he said, "Brooke, finally, this is getting ridiculous. I'm here to correct the record." And the deputy stepped in front of me before I could even answer, not aggressive, just positioned, like a door closing, and he said, "Sir, state your name." And my father's eyes flicked to the badge and back to my face like he wanted me to override authority for him, like he wanted me to do that old dance where I soften it for him so he doesn't have to face consequences. And he said, "Ethan Rowe, her father," emphasizing father like it was a legal credential. And the deputy didn't take the bait. He said, "Mr. Rowe, there is an active incident report for suspected forgery and attempted mortgage fraud tied to this parcel. You will not submit anything in her name today." And my father's smile tightened at the corners. You could see the irritation trying to crawl out, but he kept it leashed, and he leaned slightly to look past the deputy at me and said, low voice, private voice, "You're panicking. Your mother and I are trying to protect you. This condo is a liability, taxes, insurance, HOA, you don't understand." And the funniest part is he said, "You don't understand," to me while I was literally standing inside the county records office holding the fraud hold confirmation and a case number, and I answered him in the same calm tone I use when I'm talking to someone who wants chaos. "I understand perfectly. That's why I'm not signing anything." And he blinked once, and that blink was everything because he wasn't used to me saying no without explaining myself, and he tried to pivot fast because Ethan Rowe doesn't fight with feelings, he fights with narratives. And he lifted the envelope and said to the deputy, "I have a corrective deed to clean up the record. We're fixing a clerical issue." And the supervisor, Ms. Harlan, didn't even reach for it. She stayed behind her counter like it was a boundary line and said, "We do not accept walk-in corrections without review, especially not under a fraud alert hold." And my father's jaw flexed like he'd just bitten into a rock. And he switched to the oldest weapon in the family arsenal, the sister card. Because of course he did, and he said louder now so the room could hear him. "This is family. You're letting her ruin her sister's future over a misunderstanding." and I felt my stomach tighten because it was familiar. That same script from childhood. Brooke doesn't need it. Brooke can handle it. Brooke is strong. Brooke should be mature. Brooke should stop making trouble. And I looked at him and thought, you're not even ashamed. You're just annoyed your trick got caught, and I didn't react. With my face, I just held up my phone and showed the deputy the photo my mother had sent of my condo door with a new lock, and the deputy's expression changed from procedural to sharp, and he turned to my father and said, "Did you change the lock on property you do not legally possess?" And my father did the offended innocence thing, like a man pretending he's the victim of his own actions. We secured the unit. There have been threats. She's unstable. And the deputy cut him off mid-sentence. Firm and flat. Do not diagnose her. Answer the question. And my father's lips parted and closed like he was searching for a safe lie, and he said, "We had authority." And the deputy asked, "Authority from what?" And my father stalled because the truth was the only authority he had was a forged deed and a title company pipeline he was trying to sprint through before daylight hit it. And Ms. Harlan printed the ownership screen with the red banner visible, the words that matter in bold at the top, "Fraud alert recording hold active," and she slid it to the deputy like she was handing him a flashlight, and the deputy held it up at chest height and said, "This is the record today. You are not listed as owner. You are listed as a party involved in a contested recording." And I watched my father's face flush, not with guilt, with humiliation, because to him humiliation is worse than wrongdoing. And he looked around like he expected someone to rescue him, someone to whisper, "Sir, you're right, you're important, but offices don't care about your watch or your voice. They care about the database." And that's when the mask slipped just a little, and he leaned closer to me and hissed, "Fine, if you want to play it that way, we'll handle this through proper channels, and you're going to lose it in court, and you'll blame us like you always do." And I met his eyes and said quietly, "You can't sell what you don't own." And right then my phone buzzed again, and I almost laughed at the timing, because life does that sometimes. It drops receipts at the exact moment someone is trying to intimidate you, and it was an email from Angela at Seabright Title and Escrow. Subject line, "File frozen fraud investigation initiated," and I opened it, and the first sentence made my chest loosen in the smallest way. "Not relief, leverage. We have placed an immediate stop on the escrow file and preserved the remote notarization video, audit trail, and IP logs. No closing will proceed." And I turned the screen toward the deputy and Ms. Harlan, and the deputy nodded once like, "Good. Now we have a second wall." And my father saw my micro-expression change, and his eyes narrowed, and he snapped, "What did you do?" Like I'd committed the crime by stopping his crime, and I didn't answer him, because I wasn't here to debate with a man who forged my name. I was here to stack consequences, and I said to the deputy, "I want access to my condo restored today." And the deputy turned to my father and said, "Remove the lock." And my father laughed sharp. "I'm not giving her keys to a property she's going to lose." And the deputy repeated, calm like a metronome, "It is not your property." And Ms. Harlan added, "Building management has already been notified to change access codes. Your lock does not override the building's access controls." And my father's jaw tightened again, and he played his last card, the one he thinks makes him look noble. "Your sister needs this," he said, softer now, like a priest offering a moral lesson. "If you loved your family, you would stop." And I didn't raise my voice, I didn't insult him, I just said, "If you loved your daughter, you wouldn't forge her name." And you could feel the air shift, because that sentence is simple and it's deadly. It strips away the performance, and the deputy stepped closer and said, "Mr. Rowe, you need to leave this office now." And my father held his envelope like he couldn't believe paper wasn't saving him today then. He turned and walked out, controlled, because he's the kind of man who explodes where there aren't cameras, and when he disappeared through the lobby doors, I realized my hands weren't shaking, and that surprised me, because I had spent years thinking my parents made me small, but really they trained me. They trained me to stay calm in storms they created, and now I was using that calm against them. And the deputy turned to me and said, "Next step is civil. You need counsel for a quiet title action and to notify the title insurer, and we are preserving the remote notarization video and IP logs. If your parents participated, it becomes criminal." And Ms. Harlan said something that made my skin go tight again. "There's an attachment in the pending deed of trust file." And she clicked, and a scanned ID popped up, and it wasn't my current license. It was an old driver's license photo from years ago. the one I hadn't seen since I moved out, and I felt my stomach drop because you can't fake that without access, and the deputy looked at me and asked, who had access to this? And I didn't even have to think. I said, my father kept copies of everything, and I could hear my mother's old voice in my head, soft as syrup. He's just keeping it safe. Like control is a love language. And the deputy nodded like he'd heard that story before from 100 different victims who thought their parents were just organized. And he said, okay, then we treat this like active fraud, not a misunderstanding. And Ms. Harlan printed the pending submission attachment list and submitter contact details, stapled them neatly, and handed them to the deputy, and the deputy said, call the title company again, on speaker, and keep your voice calm. And I did, and Angela answered this time fast, no sweetness, just business, and I said, my father is physically at the county records office trying to submit a corrective deed. Law enforcement is present. I need written confirmation the file is frozen and that the remote notarization video is preserved. And Angela said, confirmed, file is frozen. We are issuing internal preservation holds. We are also notifying the signing service and recording agent. No signing will proceed. And then she added, Ms. Rowe, there is one more thing. And my stomach tightened because whenever someone says one more thing, it's never small. And she said, the escrow file includes a buyer packet and a listing authorization signed by your parents. And I said, they don't have authority. And she said, we know, but we need you to understand how aggressive they were moving. There was a scheduled signing window today. And I said, I already know. And she said, good, because we're also opening an internal fraud investigation on the account that submitted it. And yes, the authorized filer shows Isla Rowe. And I swallowed because that name again, and I said, my sister says she didn't sign anything. She says Dad told her it was paperwork to help me with taxes. And Angela's voice stayed level. That's consistent with identity use. We will preserve IP addresses and remote notary session access logs. And I ended the call and looked at the deputy and said, I need to get to my condo now. And he nodded. Do it and document everything. Keep the new lock. Keep the lockbox if there's one. Take photos of entry points and do not engage alone with your parents. And I drove back to the coast with my papers on the passenger seat like they were a living thing, and my phone buzzing nonstop with messages I refused to read because the point of their messages is always to pull you back into the emotional arena where they're strongest. And when I reached Seaside Villas, the lockbox was gone from the lobby door. The code had been changed, and security was waiting near the elevator like someone had warned them this unit was now a paperwork war, and the property manager met me with maintenance at my door. And the new lock my mother had installed was right there, shiny like a trophy, and the maintenance guy looked at it and said, this isn't building issued. And I said, I know. And he swapped it out fast, professional, no gossip, just tools and screws and a deadbolt clicking into place like a period at the end of a sentence. And when he handed me the removed lock in a plastic bag, I didn't toss it. I held it like evidence because that's what it was. And as I stood in my hallway with my own key back in my own door, I felt something deeper than anger. I felt clarity because my parents didn't do this because they needed money for taxes or HOA or any of the excuses they were about to invent. They did it because my grandfather gave me one thing they couldn't control and they couldn't stand it. And I walked inside and checked every window, every closet, every cabinet, because when someone is bold enough to forge a deed, you don't assume they stop at paper. And everything was mostly intact, but there were tiny signs. A chair slightly moved, a drawer not closed all the way. That quiet feeling like someone had been in your space and didn't care if you felt it. And I stood on the balcony for a second and looked at the ocean, and it was beautiful in that rude way nature is. Like it keeps being gorgeous even when your life is a mess. And I thought, my grandfather didn't just give me a condo, he gave me a test, and my parents failed it. And then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was Isla calling. And I answered because I needed to hear her voice, and she sounded breathless, confused, scared. Brooke, what is happening? Mom is crying. Dad is saying you're attacking the family. He said you're trying to take everything. And I closed my eyes and said, Isla, listen to me. Did you authorize a title company account to file documents? And she said, I don't know. Dad had me sign something weeks ago. He said it was to help you with taxes and keep the condo protected. And I said, did he show you the documents? And she hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. And she said, he said it was boring legal stuff and he was handling it. And I felt that familiar rage rise, not at my sister, at the pattern, because this is what controlling parents do. They turn siblings into tools, and then they blame you for the damage, and I said, Isla, do not sign anything else, do not send them your ID, do not join any remote notarization call. If anyone calls you claiming it's routine, hang up. And she started crying. I didn't know. And I said, I believe you, but believing you doesn't fix the record, so you're going to screenshot every message Dad sent you about this. You're going to email it to me, and you're going to stop answering them until you do. And she whispered, okay. And then she asked the question that always shows up when the family spell breaks. Are we in trouble? And I said, I don't know yet, but Dad is. And I ended the call and opened my laptop because there's a moral lesson here, and it's not cute, it's brutal. You don't beat wealthy manipulators by yelling. You beat them by documenting, by timing, by using the same systems they think only work for them. And I drafted an email to an attorney right then, short, factual, with attachments, deed copy, fraud hold confirmation, incident report number, forged deed image, deed of trust attempt log, and I wrote one line at the top, urgent. Forged quitclaim deed recorded, attempted deed of trust submitted listing me as borrower, need quiet title action and injunction. And I hit send. And then I sat down and finally opened my mother's messages because I needed to know what narrative she was pushing, and it was exactly what you'd expect. We're trying to help you. You're overreacting. You're always so dramatic. Think about your sister. And I laughed once, bitter, because when someone forges your name and changes your locks and tries to put debt on you, dramatic is just the word they use for, not obedient. And I want to ask you something because I know the comments are going to split right here. If you were me, would you block them and move on? Or would you go all the way and make sure the system permanently labels what they did as fraud so they can't do it to you again or to anyone else? Because I'll tell you the truth, I didn't want revenge when this started. I wanted peace. I wanted one quiet place my parents couldn't enter. But the second they tried to borrow against my name, they turned it into war. And the next morning I woke up to a new email from Angela at Seabright, subject line, remote notarization session preserved. And the first sentence made my stomach clench. We have reviewed preliminary audit information, and right under it, the session metadata indicates a participant device and network associated with the Rowe household. And I stared at that line because it was the closest thing to a fingerprint. And then she added, we are pulling video and full IP logs for law enforcement. And I whispered, got you? Not excited. Not triumphant, just steady, because here's the thing about people who abuse paper, they get sloppy when they get greedy, and my parents weren't just greedy, they were rushed, and rushed criminals leave trails. And as I sat there staring at the ocean through my balcony door, I realized something that made me feel both sick and strangely calm. This wasn't their first attempt to rewrite reality with documents. It was just the first time I ran the title record fast enough to catch them mid-swing. And once you see how close you came to waking up with a loan in your name and strangers touring your condo like it's a museum, you stop asking, why would they do this? And you start asking, how many times have they done this without you noticing? And that question, that one question, was exactly what pushed me to do the next thing that changed everything, because I didn't just want my condo back. I wanted the full paper trail of my family's lies. And when my attorney called me later that day and said, Brooke, I can file the quiet title action and stop this, but you need to be ready for retaliation. I looked at my phone, saw 3 missed calls from my father, and I said, I'm ready. Because if Ethan Rowe thought freezing a file would scare me into surrender, he was about to learn what happens when the person you've always called dramatic finally becomes precise. I didn't sleep that night like a normal person sleeps. I slept like someone guarding a crime scene, waking up to every building creak, checking my phone like it was a heartbeat monitor, and every time I saw a new notification, my stomach did that cold drop thing because I kept thinking, what if they filed something else while I was brushing my teeth? What if they found a different county, a different portal, a different loophole? Because people like Ethan Rowe don't stop when they get caught. They just change angles and then pretend you're the problem for not letting them win quietly. And by 7:12 a.m. my attorney called. And his voice was calm in that way that's supposed to calm you too, but all it really does is remind you you're now living inside a system that moves like a glacier unless you push it. And he said, Brooke, I reviewed what you sent. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a coordinated attempt to divest you of title and encumber you with debt. We're filing a quiet title action and an emergency injunction. And I said, how fast? And he said, "Today," and I said, "Good, because the only thing worse than being betrayed is watching your betrayal become pending review while your parents keep playing offense." And he told me to do 3 things immediately, not later, immediately, and I'm telling you this because this is the part most people don't understand until it's too late, he said. 1. You need to put the condo's title insurer on notice if there is. 1. 2. You need to pull your credit reports and place fraud alerts because they already used your identity once. And 3. You need to write a timeline while it's fresh, every contact, every door knock, every call, every name, every timestamp, because memory is emotional and courts are not. And I laughed once under my breath because my parents always mocked me for being too detailed, and now detail was literally my shield. And then he said the line that made my chest tighten. "And you need to be ready, because your father will retaliate in the only ways he knows how, socially, financially, and psychologically." And I said, "I already feel it coming, because my phone was already buzzing with that family group chat energy, the one where nobody says what happened, they just accuse you of hurting everyone." And I opened the messages, and it was exactly what you'd expect. My mother, Nora Rowe, typing like she's writing scripture, "We raised you better than this." And my father, Ethan, sending one sentence like a threat wrapped in disappointment, "If you do this publicly, you will regret it." And Isla sending panicked voice notes in between like she was drowning. "Brooke, please. Dad says you're trying to ruin him. He says the condo was never really yours. He says Grandpa promised it to the family." And that last one hit a nerve because that is the lie wealthy families love. The family asset lie. The communal ownership lie. The you're selfish for wanting your own name. On your own deed lie. And I didn't respond with feelings, I responded with action. I texted Isla one line, "Stop messaging in the group. Screenshot everything Dad is saying, send it to me privately." And then I did something that felt petty but was actually survival. I walked through my condo with my camera on and narrated like I was filming a documentary. Front door, deadbolt, timestamp, windows locked, drawers closed, nothing missing, new lock bagged and labeled, because when you're dealing with people who rewrite reality, you create your own reality with evidence. And then I drove straight to the attorney's office with the ocean still on my skin and adrenaline sitting behind my ribs. And his office was glass and quiet and smelled like money that stays calm. And he didn't waste time. He slid paperwork across the table: petition, affidavit, exhibits, fraud hold confirmation, incident report number, the forged deed image, the deed of trust submission log, the email from Seabright, confirming file frozen and preservation. And he said, "We're going to ask the court to declare the forged instrument void, confirm your title, and enjoin your parents from recording any further documents related to this property." And I asked, "Can we also stop them from contacting building management?" And he said, "Yes, but the judge will want to see pattern." And I said, "Pattern is my parents' hobby." And I pulled out my phone and opened the photo of my mother's message with the lock caption, and I watched his eyes narrow at it, not emotionally, professionally, like, "Oh, you're that kind of messy." And he said, "Good, we include that." And then he looked at me and said, "I'm going to tell you something blunt. Your father likely believes he can outspend you." And I said, "That's cute, because my parents have always used money like a voice amplifier, and the truth is I don't have to be richer than them. I just have to be right longer than they can lie." And then he asked me to recount the day out loud, not as a story, as a timeline, and I did. The realtor's knock, the stranger's sunglasses, the folder with my condo photo printed like it already belonged to someone else, the lockbox, the access code, the county clerk freezing mid-click, the supervisor printing the quitclaim deed with my trace signature, the fraud hold banner turning red on screen, the deed of trust submission minutes later listing me as borrower, my old driver's license scanned into the file, my father showing up at the recorder's office with a corrective deed like he was fixing a typo, and when I finished, my attorney nodded once and said, "This is strong." And I didn't feel proud, I felt furious, because you know what makes you furious in a clean way, not rage, precision rage. It's realizing your parents didn't do this by accident. They did it with planning, with vendors, with portals, with notaries, with a title company pipeline, and they did it because they expected you to freeze. Because they expected you to get emotional and loud and messy so they could point at you and say, "See, she's unstable." And I said to my attorney, "What about the remote notarization video?" And he leaned back and said, "That's the knife." And then he explained something that made my skin crawl. He said remote notarization platforms maintain audit trails, session logs, sometimes video, sometimes screenshots, IP addresses, device identifiers, and if my father appeared off-camera coaching, or if my mother held up my old ID, or if the session shows identity mismatch, that's not just proof of forgery, that's proof of intent. And I nodded, and I felt something settle in me again, that cold, clear thing that shows up when you realize you're done playing defense. And then he said, "Now, here's the ugly part. They will try to get ahead of this." And I said, "How?" And he said, "They will try to poison your credibility." And I didn't even need him to finish because my phone buzzed right then with a new email from a number I hadn't seen in years, a family friend. Subject line, "Concerned about you," and I opened it, and it wasn't concerned, it was a phishing line. "Your parents are worried you're having a breakdown. They said you're making claims about fraud. I hope you get help." And I stared at the screen because it was so textbook it was almost boring, and I said out loud, "They're doing it," and my attorney nodded and said, "Yes, and we counter it by staying factual. You don't respond to gossip, you respond to courts." And then he told me to do something that felt like putting a padlock on my identity. He said, "We're going to send a litigation hold notice to Seabright and to the remote notary vendor, instructing them to preserve all data, including session video, chat logs, audio, device metadata, IP logs, and any communications with your parents or sister." And I asked, "Can we also subpoena it?" And he said, "Yes, once the case is filed." And then he looked at me and said, "Brooke, I need you to answer one question honestly. Not because I'm judging you, because strategy depends on truth. Do you believe your sister knowingly participated?" And I paused because this is where family stories get sticky, because if Isla is guilty, I need to treat her like a participant. And if Isla is a pawn, I need to treat her like evidence. And I said, "I think she signed something because Dad told her it was about taxes. I think her name was used as authorization because it looks cleaner." And he nodded and said, "That's plausible." And then he said, "We will be careful how we frame her involvement, because your parents will try to hide behind her." And that made me feel sick, because I could already see it. Ethan Rose standing in front of a judge, saying, "We were just trying to help Brooke. Isla handled the paperwork. Brooke is emotional." And I could see Nora Rowe crying on cue, the way she cries when she wants a room to bend. And I could see Isla sitting there confused and ashamed. And I realized the cruelty wasn't just the forged deed. It was the way they were willing to sacrifice one daughter to control another. And that's when my attorney's assistant walked in and handed him a printed screenshot. And he looked at it and then looked at me and said, "Your father just tried to schedule another showing." And I blinked. "How do you know?" And he turned the paper toward me. It was a forwarded email from the building manager. The manager had gotten a call from a number matching Ethan's, requesting temporary code access for vendors. And I felt my teeth clench, because even after the fraud hold, even after the sheriff, even after Seabright freezing, he was still trying to worm into the building like a rat testing doors. And my attorney said, "Good, that's another exhibit." And I said, "I want to end his access permanently." And he said, "We will." And then he told me to do one more thing that felt humiliating but necessary. He said, "Change every account tied to your identity, email, passwords, banking, property management portal if there is one, and set up a new mailing address for legal notices." And I said, "They already used their home address on the submission." And he nodded. "Exactly, because people who commit paper fraud don't just steal your asset, they steal your notifications, they reroute your reality, so you don't even know you're being robbed until it's recorded." And I left his office with a stack of filed documents and a calendar of court dates, and a plan that felt like armor. And I drove back to the condo, and for the first time I noticed the little things again. The smell of salt, the gulls yelling like they always do, the sunlight on the hallway tiles. And it made me angry that my parents had dragged this ugliness into a place my grandfather loved for its quiet. And I sat at the kitchen counter and started writing the timeline, not because I love paperwork, because I love winning. And I wrote it with timestamps like I was writing a military report. 10:03 Realtor Knox, 10:05 listing agreement photographed, 10:40 county office number pulled, 11:22 clerk confirms quitclaim deed, 11:31 supervisor prints forged deed, 11:37 fraud alert hold placed, 11:44 pending deed of trust discovered, 12:06 sheriff report initiated, 12:52 father appears at recorder's office, 1:10 Seabright compliance confirms file frozen. And as I wrote it, my phone buzzed again, a new number, unknown. And I let it go to voicemail, and the voicemail came in as a transcript, and it was my father's voice, calm like poison. Brooke, you are humiliating your mother. Call me, we can fix this. You are making irreversible decisions. And I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was predictable, because when he says, we can fix this, he means I can still control this if you come back into the emotional arena. And I didn't call, I forwarded it to my attorney, and then my mother texted again. We are coming down there to talk like adults. And that one made my pulse tighten, because talk like adults in my family means corner you, overwhelm you, gaslight you, and then leave with something. So I called building security and told them plainly, do not allow Ethan or Nora Rowe into the building, do not accept any documents from them, and if they show up, call me and call law enforcement. And the security guard didn't argue. He just said, understood, in the tone of a man who has dealt with rich people trying to bend rules. And then I got a notification from my credit monitoring app, a soft ping that did not match the violence it represented, inquiry detected, and my stomach flipped because while I was filing court documents, someone was still trying to open a financial door in my name, and I pulled the report, and there it was, a credit inquiry from a lender I didn't recognize, and it wasn't confirmed as a loan yet, but it was a probe, like someone tapping the glass to see if it cracks. And I sat back in my chair, and I swear I felt my grandfather's presence in the room, not spiritual, practical, like, don't freeze now. And I called my attorney and said, they're still trying, credit inquiry just hit. And he said, good, we add it and we escalate. And then he told me something that made me feel both sick and empowered. He said, Brooke, if they're willing to use your identity for a deed of trust, they may try to attach other debt to you. So we're going to file for a temporary restraining order preventing them from using your name or representing themselves as agents of your property. And I said, do it. And then my phone buzzed again, and it was Isla, and she sounded broken. Brooke, Dad is furious. He's saying you're disowning the family. He's saying you're going to get him arrested. And I paused and said quietly, Isla, he forged my name and tried to put a mortgage on me. If he gets arrested, that's not because I'm mean. That's because he committed a crime. And she whispered, Mom says you're being dramatic. And I said, dramatic is what they call you when you don't cooperate. And she started crying harder and said, I didn't mean to be part of this. And I said, then help me, send me every text, every email, every document Dad asked you to sign, and tell me exactly when and where. And she hesitated, and I could hear the loyalty war inside her. And then she said, okay. And she started listing things, a PDF she signed, a DocuSign request, a phone call with someone from escrow, a screenshot of a tax update. And as she spoke, I realized something chilling. My father didn't just forge. He built a whole fake professional world around the fraud to make it feel normal, because that's how rich predators operate. They don't rob you with masks, they rob you with forms. And when Isla finished, she said, Brooke, are you safe? And I looked around my condo, doors locked, codes changed, security on alert, and I said, not emotionally, but physically, yes. And I hung up and saved her messages in a folder labeled Isla Evidence, because I needed to separate my sister the person from my sister the paper trail. And then, right as the sun started dropping and the ocean got that darker blue color that makes tourists take photos, there was a knock at my door. Not the confident realtor knock, not the maintenance knock, a slow knock, like someone testing whether I'd open, and I didn't move. I went to the peephole, and my mother was standing there with her sunglasses on. Even though it was late, and beside her was my father, hands clasped in front like he was trying to look calm, and behind them was a woman holding a clipboard, and my stomach went ice cold because I recognized the setup. That woman wasn't family. She was a witness, a professional, someone to validate whatever story they were about to tell. And I heard my mother's voice through the door, syrupy, honey, open up, we just want to talk. And my father added, we brought someone to explain the paperwork, so you stop spiraling. And I stood there with my hand on my phone, not shaking, recording, and I didn't open the door. I called security, and then I called the deputy's office number from the incident report. And as the phone rang, I looked through the peephole and watched my mother adjust her hair like she was about to perform, and I realized this was it. This was the moment they would either retreat because the system was watching, or escalate because they thought intimidation would work better than paper. And when the dispatcher answered, and I said, this is Brooke Carter, active fraud report. My parents are at my condo door right now with a third party. I need an officer. My father's smile vanished on the other side of the door like he felt the shift through the wood, and I swear you could hear the consequences arriving before the sirens ever did. The knock turned into that quiet, patient tapping that feels polite until you realize it's not politeness, it's entitlement wearing a cardigan, and I stayed behind the door with my phone recording, thumb hovering over speaker, listening to my mother's sweet voice stretch itself into a weapon. "Brooke, stop being like this." And my father's voice right behind her, lower and tighter. "Open the door. We're not doing this in the hallway." Like he owned the hallway, the building, the air, and then the third woman, the clipboard lady, cleared her throat and said, "Miss Carter, I'm here to facilitate a calm resolution." And that sentence alone told me everything because nobody facilitates anything without an agenda, and I said through the door, calm enough to make it sting, name and company, and there was a pause, and then she said, "My name is Denise Hall. I'm a mobile notary and signing agent." And I almost laughed because of course they brought a notary, because my parents don't fight with fists, they fight with paper, and paper is the only weapon that lets them pretend they're helping. And then my mother tried the soft guilt angle. "Honey, you're scaring the neighbors." And I leaned closer to the door and said, "The neighbors should be scared of forgery, not of me." And that's when I heard my father exhale that sharp breath he always does when he's about to flip from charm to control, and he said, "Stop recording." And I said, "No." And he said, "You're spiraling." And I said, "No, I'm documenting." And you could hear him recalibrating because documentation is the enemy of gaslighting. And then Denise, the notary, tried her professional voice again. "We have corrective documents prepared to address the misunderstandings in the public record." And my mother added quickly, "It's just to clean things up, sweetheart, so you're not overwhelmed." And I could almost see her face through the door, that soft smile like she's offering soup when she's actually offering a leash. And I said, "A corrected document requires my consent, and I am not consenting to anything." And then my father went for the dagger. "If you refuse, you'll trigger penalties and the HOA will come after you, and you'll lose this place anyway." And I paused because that's the kind of lie that works on people who don't understand leverage. Because fear makes you sign, fear makes you obey, fear makes you hand your life over to the person promising relief. And I said, "If you're so worried about my taxes and HOA, why did you file a forged quitclaim deed yesterday and try to submit a deed of trust in my name today?" And there was this tiny silence that felt delicious because it was the sound of a con artist realizing their mark can read. And then my mother snapped out of sweetness for half a second. "Because you're ungrateful," she hissed, and then she caught herself and tried to smooth it out. "Because you don't understand how burdensome this is." And I said, "Burden is not an excuse for fraud." And then my phone buzzed and it was security calling back, and I answered on speaker with the door still closed. "This is Brooke." And the guard said, "Ma'am, we're on our way up. Please remain inside." And my father heard that and said, "You called security?" Like I'd called the police on Santa Claus, and I said, "Yes." And then my mother did the classic move, the one that's so common it should be a diagnosis. She said, "Look at what you're making us do." Like their choices were my hands on their wrists. And Denise, the notary, shifted on the other side because she finally realized she was standing in the middle of something criminal, not family drama, and she asked, "Miss Carter, are you refusing to sign?" And I said, "Yes, and I'm informing you there is an active fraud investigation with a case number and a county recording hold. And any attempt to get me to sign under false pretenses will be reported." And then I heard paper rustle, and my father said, "You don't even know what you're refusing." And I said, "You're right, so slide the documents under the door." And he didn't, because con artists hate transparency, and instead he said, "Open the door and we'll review it like adults." And I said, "Adults don't forge their child's name." And that's when the elevator dinged down the hall. Footsteps approached, and the security guard rounded the corner with a second guard behind him, both in uniform, calm faces, and my mother turned instantly into her public persona, shoulders back, sad eyes. "Oh, thank God," she said. "We've been so worried." And it was so gross how fast she switched masks that I almost admired the craft, like watching a professional liar do ballet. And the guard said, "Ma'am, sir, you need to step away from the unit door." And my father smiled and said, "Of course, we're family. "We're just here to talk." And the guard looked at Denise and asked, "Who are you?" And she said, "I'm a notary." And the guard's eyebrows lifted like, "Why is a notary here at a condo door?" And I spoke through the door. "Security. I have an active case for forged deed and attempted mortgage fraud. They are not authorized to be here, and they changed my lock." And my father's voice sharpened. "Brooke, stop lying." And I said, "Not lying. I have the bag with the lock." And then the guard's tone changed from friendly to firm. "Sir, ma'am, you need to leave the premises." And my mother tried the sob voice. "She's having an episode." And I said through the door, "I want that on record. She's claiming I'm unstable to justify fraud." And the guard looked uncomfortable because now it's not family. It's an allegation in a hallway, and my father did something I will never forget. He pointed at the guard like the guard was an employee in his own house and said, "We have ownership interests we will be entering." And the guard said, "No, you won't." And I heard my father's temper slip. "Do you know who I am?" And the guard said, "I don't care." And that was the first time all day someone treated my father like the laws apply to him, and it rattled him. You could hear it. And then the second guard asked me through the door, "Miss Carter, do you want police dispatched?" And I said, "Yes." And my mother's breath caught like she couldn't believe her favorite threat, public shame, was about to boomerang. And my father leaned close to the door and hissed, "You're destroying your family." And I said, "No, I'm stopping you." And then, because I'm petty in the healthiest way, I said something I knew would pierce them. "My grandpa gave me this condo, so you couldn't touch it." And my mother made this sound, like a choke mixed with anger, because that was the real wound, not money, not property. The wound was control slipping. And then my phone buzzed again, and it was Isla. And for a second I almost didn't pick up because I didn't want her voice to soften me, but I answered because this is what I promised myself. I would keep my head and still keep my humanity. And Isla whispered, "Brooke, Dad is saying if you don't sign tonight, he'll fix it another way." And I said quietly, "What did he mean by another way?" And Isla sounded like she was shaking. "He said he already has someone at a bank. He said he'll file it under a different description. He said the county hold won't stop it." And my stomach tightened because this wasn't just a theft attempt. This was a campaign. And I asked, "Are you with them?" And she said, "No, I'm at home. Mom told me not to come." And that line told me Isla was being used as clean cover while they did the dirty work. And I said, "Screenshot everything, send it now, and do not answer any calls from anyone claiming to be escrow." And she said, "Okay." And the call ended, and right then the hallway got louder because my father was arguing with security. "You can't trespass me from my own property." And one guard said, "You're not the recorded owner." And my father snapped, "Recorded," like he wanted to spit, because the record was the one thing he couldn't charm. And then my mother did the meanest trick in her whole toolbox. She said loudly, "She's mentally unwell. She doesn't understand what she inherited." And she said it with the kind of calm that's meant to make strangers nod. And I felt my hands clench around my phone, not because I was scared, because I was furious at how familiar it was. How many people hear that sentence from a parent and immediately doubt the child? And I said through the door, loud enough for everyone, "If I'm mentally unwell, why are you trying to put a mortgage in my name?" And the guards went quiet, because that's the kind of question that collapses a narrative. And my father's voice got tight. "No one is mortgaging anything." And I said, "The county queue shows a deed of trust submission listing me as borrower, and the title company froze your file." And then I heard Denise, the notary, say nervously, "Mr. Rowe, I wasn't told there was a fraud hold." And my father snapped at her, "Stay out of it." And that snapped something else too, because now Denise understood she'd been brought in as a tool, not as a professional. And she stepped back and said, "I'm leaving." And my mother tried to soothe her. No, it's fine." But Denise walked toward the elevator anyway, and I watched through the peephole as she pressed the button like she couldn't get away fast enough. And listen, I'm going to tell you something that matters, because if you've ever been the person in a family where the rules don't protect you, you learn this the hard way. Predators hate witnesses who aren't paid. And Denise was an unpaid witness who had just realized she might be on a future subpoena. And then the building's intercom crackled and a voice said, "Officers are on site." And my heart did that steadying thing it does when help is procedural, not emotional. And within minutes 2 officers came down the hallway, one speaking to security, one scanning the scene, and my father went right back to charm mode. "Officer, thank you. This is a family matter." And the officer didn't even flinch. He said, "We're responding to a call about unlawful lock change and suspected fraud." And my father's smile froze, and my mother tried tears. "She's confused. We're just trying to protect her." And the officer said, "Ma'am, step back." And then, the best part, the part that felt like a tiny piece of justice you can taste, the officer asked, "Do you have proof of ownership or authorization to be here?" And my father reached into his manila envelope like a magician about to do a trick, and he pulled out a paper and held it up. "We have documentation." And the officer said, "Let me see." And my father hesitated for a half second too long, and that hesitation was everything, because even he knew his documentation was a counterfeit mask, and he handed it over, and the officer looked at it for maybe 3 seconds and said, "This isn't a court order." And my father said, "It's a corrective deed." And the officer's eyes narrowed. A deed is not something you correct in a hallway. And then he asked the question that made my father's face flush. "Did you change the lock?" And my father started, "We had to secure it." And the officer cut him off. "Did you change the lock?" And my mother jumped in. "We had authority." And the officer asked, "Authority from who?" And my father's mouth opened, and for the first time all day there was no script line that worked, because the only authority they had was the forged instrument. And the officer said, "Miss Carter, are you inside?" And I said through the door, "Yes." And he said, "Do you want them removed?" And I said, "Yes." And my father's voice rose. "You can't remove me, I'm her father." And the officer said, "Sir, father is not a legal status that overrides trespass." And I swear I almost smiled because it was the cleanest moral lesson in one sentence. Love is not ownership. Family is not a permission slip. And then the officer said, "Miss Carter, do you have documentation of the fraud hold?" And I said, "Yes." And I slid a copy of the confirmation under the door like I was feeding a monster its leash, and the officer picked it up, read it, and his posture hardened, and he looked at my father and said, "There is an active fraud alert on this parcel." And my father snapped, "That's temporary." And the officer said, "Temporary is enough to stop you from doing anything here today." And then, just when I thought it was done, my father did the dumbest thing a controlling man can do in front of uniformed authority. He stepped closer to the door and said, "Brooke, open up, now." And the officer put a hand up between us. "Back up." And my father said, "This is my daughter." And the officer said, "Back up." Again, louder, and my father's jaw flexed, and my mother grabbed his arm, whispering, "Ethan, stop." And he yanked away, and the officer said, "Sir, if you don't comply, you will be cited." And my father went quiet, the way he goes quiet when he's losing in public and saving the explosion for later. And the officer turned to security and said, "Escort them out." And my mother's face twisted, not into sadness, into rage, and she said, "You're going to regret this." And she aimed it at me like a curse, and I said through the door, "I regret trusting you." And that landed because she made a sound like she'd been slapped. And then they were walking away down the hallway, escorted, still trying to keep their posture intact like posture can erase felonies. And right as the elevator doors closed, my father looked back and said, "This is not over." And I said to myself, silently, "You're right, it isn't." Because the next fight wouldn't be in a hallway, it would be in court, in credit systems, in bank portals, in the quiet places people don't check until the damage is done. And the officers asked me to open the door so they could verify I was okay. And I did, just a crack at first, chain latched, and the officer's eyes scanned the new lock bag, the paperwork, the phone in my hand still recording, and he said, "Ma'am, you did the right thing calling." And I wanted to say, it shouldn't take cops to stop parents from stealing from their child, but I didn't, because this isn't therapy, this is strategy. And I said, "I want a report for the unlawful lock change and the harassment at my door." And he nodded, "We'll document it." And then he said something that made my blood go colder than the ocean ever could. "If they have your old ID and your signature samples, they may try again in a different form." And I said, "I know." And then my phone buzzed, one new email, subject line, "Remote Notarization Evidence Update from Seabright Compliance," and I opened it and saw the first line, "We have retrieved additional session artifacts beyond the initial audit trail." And my throat tightened because that sounded like video, screenshots, something concrete, and the second line made my stomach drop. The session includes a secondary participant joining from a separate device. And I stared at the words because a secondary participant means someone else was in that notarization call. Not just my parents, not just the notary, someone behind them, advising, directing, maybe even impersonating. And if you think this story is just about my parents being greedy, you're missing it. This was organized, it was coached, it was structured like a play, and I felt that cold, clear clarity return because now I didn't just want to stop them, I wanted to see the whole network they were using, who was helping them launder fraud into paperwork, and I turned to the officer and said, "I'm going to forward this email to the deputy on my case right now," and he said, "Do it." And as I typed, my phone buzzed again. This time a text from Isla. One sentence that hit like a punch. "Brooke, Dad just told me if you don't back off, he'll make sure Grandpa's will gets re-examined, and you'll lose more than the condo." And I stared at that message, because that wasn't a threat about property. That was a threat about my grandfather, about dragging his legacy through court just to punish me for saying no. And if you've ever dealt with a family that uses love like a lawsuit, you know that's the moment the game changes, because now it's not just theft, it's spite with a legal budget. And I looked out at the ocean through my balcony door and realized my grandfather didn't just leave me a condo, he left me a test, not of whether I could keep a view, but whether I could finally stop letting my parents rewrite reality. And I promise you, the next move I made wasn't emotional, it was surgical, because if they wanted a war of paper, I was about to make sure every single piece of paper they touched started pointing back at them. The next morning the ocean looked fake, like a screensaver someone forgot to turn off, and that made me angrier because my life was actively on fire and the world had the nerve to be pretty, and I sat at my kitchen counter with the sliding door cracked just enough to let salt air in and remind me why my grandfather loved this place. And I lined everything up like a crime scene museum exhibit, because when you're dealing with people like my parents, you don't talk it out. You build a timeline that can survive a courtroom, and I said out loud to myself, "Okay, Brooke, you're not fighting feelings, you're fighting forms." And then I opened my laptop and pulled up 3 tabs: County Recorder Fraud Unit, the Title Company Compliance email thread, and a blank document titled, "Do Not Trust Anyone," because I needed that reminder like a seatbelt. And then I did something that felt ridiculous, but saved me later. I wrote the time at the top, 7:13 a.m., and then I wrote what my body felt like. Hands steady, stomach hot, jaw clenched, because when people try to twist your story later, your own memory becomes evidence too. And then my phone buzzed again with my mother's name, and I didn't answer, I just stared at it ringing like a snake under glass. And in my head I could hear her already. "Honey, this is a misunderstanding. Honey, we were trying to help. Honey, why are you making us look bad?" And I whispered, "Not today." And I hit decline, and right then another call came in, unknown number, local area code. And I answered because unknown numbers are how lies wear new clothes, and a man said, bright and professional, "Hi, Miss Carter. This is Logan with Coastal Lending Partners. Just confirming your signing appointment this afternoon." And I felt my skin go cold because they were still running plays even after the file freeze. So I kept my voice soft and simple like a trap. "What signing appointment?" And he laughed like we were friends. "For your deed of trust package. We just need you on a quick video call, super easy." And I said, "What address is the collateral?" And there was a micro pause, the kind of pause a script doesn't account for. And then he read my condo address, and I said, "What borrower name is on the file?" And he said my name like he was handing me a crown, and I didn't scream, I didn't cuss, I just said, "This loan is fraudulent. There is a law enforcement case number and a county fraud hold, and you are being recorded right now." And his voice dropped a half octave. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean." And I said, "I mean whoever submitted this used a forged deed and a stolen ID, and if you contact me again about this loan, my attorney will treat it as knowing participation." And he started to backpedal. Okay, I'll escalate." And I said, "Before you escalate, tell me who your signing service is." And he hesitated, and I said, "Logan, I'm not asking to be difficult. I'm asking because someone is trying to chain debt to my name, and you're either going to help me stop it or you're going to end up in an evidence packet." And he exhaled, and finally he gave me a name, a signing vendor, and then he said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know." And I said, "I know you didn't. That's the point, they're counting on you not knowing." And I hung up and immediately screenshot my call log, because receipts are oxygen in families like mine. And then I did the next thing that felt petty, but was actually smart. I walked to my front door, looked at the peephole, and taped a white index card right beneath it that said notice, "Property Fraud Investigation Active." All contact must be in writing. No one is authorized to enter without my consent. And if you're listening right now and thinking that's dramatic, let me ask you this. If someone was trying to steal your identity and your property on the same day, would you be polite or would you be clear? Because clarity is the only language thieves respect. And then I called my attorney, the real one this time, not a hypothetical, a woman named Tessa Lang who sounded like a scalpel wrapped in velvet. And when she answered, she didn't waste time with comfort. She said, "Give me the short version and do not soften it." And I loved her immediately, so I gave her the timeline. Grandfather deed to me recorded. Forged quitclaim recorded yesterday transferring to my parents. Attempted deed of trust submission today listing me as borrower. Old ID used. Lock changed. Police report opened. Title company froze file. And she cut in once. "Who has access to your identity documents?" And I said, "My parents." And apparently they used my sister's name as authorized filer. And she said, "Okay, we're going to do 2 tracks, civil and protective." And I said, "Talk to me." And she said, "Civil is a quiet title action and an emergency injunction to prevent further conveyances. Protective is credit freeze, fraud alert, and a written notice blast to every entity involved, HOA, building management, any lender, any title company, because the goal is to make you radioactive to fraud." And I felt this weird relief because for the first time since that knock, someone was speaking. Strategy, not emotion. And I said, "How fast?" And she said, "Today." And I said, "Good." And then she asked, "Do you want to confront your parents?" And I laughed once, short and humorless. "They've been confronting me my whole life. I want to corner them with facts." And she said, "Then we do not speak to them on the phone. Ever, we speak through filings." And she paused and her voice sharpened. "And Brooke, I need you to understand something. Your parents are not treating you like family. They're treating you like an obstacle. So stop negotiating with them like they're reasonable." And I stared out at the ocean while she said that, and it hit me like a hand on my shoulder, because that was the trap I'd always fallen into, hoping a moral argument would work on people who don't have morals. And I said, "Okay." And then I asked her, "What about my sister?" Because Isla was a mess in this, and Tessa said, "Your sister is either complicit or collateral, and we treat her as a potential witness, not a confidant." And that stung because I wanted to believe Isla was separate from them, and maybe she was, but separation doesn't matter when someone is using your name to commit fraud. And then Tessa said, "Send me everything now." And I emailed her the forged deed image, the fraud hold confirmation, the sheriff case number, the Seabright compliance email, the note about the secondary participant joining from a separate device. And then she called me back within 10 minutes. And her first words were, "Secondary participant means your parents had help." And I said, "Help like who?" And she said, "Sometimes it's a crooked notary. Sometimes it's a signing agent who looks away. Sometimes it's a family friend who works in escrow. But the point is someone thought this was safe enough to do in daylight." And that made my stomach roll because daylight crimes mean confidence, and confidence usually means practice. And then she said, "We're going to subpoena the remote notarization platform for IP logs and video." And I said, "Good." And she said, "And we're going to send a preservation letter to every party involved because people lose files when they realize they're exposed." And I felt my pulse steady because now the story wasn't chaos. It was containment. And right as I was about to breathe for the first time, my phone buzzed with a group text, Mom, Dad, and Isla. And my mother wrote, "We're meeting at noon. Bring the deed. We're fixing this like adults." And my father added, "Stop embarrassing us." And Isla wrote, "Brooke, please, I didn't know, I swear." And there it was, the old choreography, my parents issuing commands like kings, my sister pleading like the favored child who never faces consequences, and me being asked to carry the emotional load of everyone else's choices. And I stared at the screen, and my brain did that neurotic little spiral, the one that says, what if you're wrong? What if you overreacted? What if they really were trying to help? And then I remembered a realtor knocking like he already had permission, and I remembered the new lock on my door, and I remembered my name listed as borrower on a loan I never asked for, and I typed back one line that felt like a funeral and a liberation at the same time. All communication goes through my attorney. Do not come to my condo again. And my father responded instantly, "You think a lawyer makes you powerful?" And I didn't reply because silence is a boundary too, and then the pattern interrupt hit, my doorbell rang. Not a knock, a bell. Cheerful, like an ice cream truck, and my stomach dropped, and I moved quietly to the peephole, and there was a man holding a clipboard and a small black case, smiling like he was here to fix a leaky faucet, and he said through the door, "Hi, I'm with Pacific Signings. I'm here for your noon appointment." And I felt heat rush up my neck because that meant my parents didn't stop. They just rerouted, like roaches when you turn on the kitchen light, and I kept my voice calm. "There is no appointment." And he said, "It's on my schedule." And I said, "Then your schedule is evidence." And he laughed awkwardly. "Ma'am, I just need your ID." And I said, "Step back from my door." And he said, "I can't leave without client confirmation." And I said, "Here's your confirmation. You're being used in a fraud attempt." And then I opened the door just a crack with the chain latched, held up my phone screen showing the sheriff case number and the fraud hold confirmation and said, "Take a photo, send it to your supervisor and leave." And his smile faded, and he leaned in to look at the screen, and I watched the exact moment his face changed from annoyed to alarmed, because normal people don't want to be anywhere near crime. And he stepped back like the hallway suddenly had teeth. "I didn't know," he said, and I said, "Of course you didn't. That's why they picked you." And he started fumbling with his phone, whispering, Okay. And then he said something that made my blood ice over. "They told me you might resist. They said you were emotional." And I felt my jaw clench so hard it hurt because that was my mother's favorite trick, pre-poison the well. "Label me unstable so any refusal looks like proof." And I said, "Who told you that?" And he hesitated, and then he said, "The contact on the file is listed as Isla Carter." And I swear my heart did a weird double beat, because either Isla's being framed or Isla's involved or Isla's been signing things without reading, and I needed the truth, not the fantasy. And then I heard footsteps in the stairwell, heavier, faster, and my breath caught because I knew that rhythm. My father walks like he's late to control you, and the signing guy looked down the hall and went pale. "Oh," he said quietly, "they're here." And then my father's voice boomed before I even saw him. "There you are." Like the hallway was his living room, and he rounded the corner with my mother right behind him, and Isla trailing like a ghost, eyes red, and my father's smile was too sharp. "This is getting ridiculous," he said, and my mother put a hand over her heart like she was the victim. "Honey, you're breaking this family," and Isla whispered, "I didn't sign anything, I swear." And the signing guy backed away like he wanted to melt into the wall, and my father pointed at him. "We have an appointment," and the guy stammered, "Sir, I've been informed there's a fraud hold." And my father's face flashed, not surprise, anger, because the script wasn't going his way, and he snapped, "Who informed you?" And the guy nodded toward my door, toward me, and my father looked at me like I'd slapped him, and he said, "Open the door." And I said, calm, almost bored, "No." And he said, "You are not going to ruin this." And I said, "You ruined it when you forged my name." And my mother's voice turned syrupy. "We didn't forge anything, sweetheart. This is for your protection." And I said, "Protection doesn't require a stolen ID and a secret lock change." And then Isla started crying for real, not the performative kind, the messy kind. And she said, "Dad, stop. What did you do?" And my father barked, "Isla, enough." And there it was, the hierarchy, the same one we grew up in. Father commands, mother reframes, sister absorbs, and I refuse, and that refusal is what they hate most. And I looked straight at Isla through the peephole crack, and I said, "Did you authorize a title company account?" And she shook her head hard. "No." And my mother cut in fast. "She doesn't understand paperwork, like incompetence was a family brand." And I said, "That's convenient." And then I did the most satisfying thing I've ever done in my life. I put my phone on speaker, hit call, and dialed Deputy Miles. And when he answered, I said, "Deputy, they're at my door with a signing agent." And my father's face changed, because he thought the hallway was private, and now it was a stage, and the deputy's voice came through clear. "Ma'am, are you safe?" And I said, "Yes, but they're attempting to proceed with a signing after the fraud hold." And the deputy said, "Stay inside. Officers are en route." And my mother's eyes widened because she wasn't expecting consequences to walk on two legs, and my father snarled, "You're insane." And I said, "No, I'm done." And the signing guy quietly slid his badge into his case and started backing away because he understood he was minutes away from being questioned. And then my father leaned in close to my door and whispered something meant only for me. the voice he uses when he wants fear to do the work. If you keep pushing, I'll make sure you lose everything Grandpa left you. And I felt that old instinct to shrink, to appease, to protect the peace. And then I felt something better rise up, something steady, and I whispered back, "Try." And he flinched like he wasn't used to me having teeth. And just then the elevator dinged, and the hallway filled with that calm authority again. Uniforms, radios, clipped voices, and my father's posture stiffened into his public mask, and my mother's face folded into wounded innocence. And Isla wiped her tears fast, and I opened my door enough to step into the hallway with the chain off now because I had backup. And the officer looked at my parents and said, "You've been instructed not to. Contact Ms. Carter at the property." And my father started, "Officer, this is a misunderstanding." And the officer cut him off. "Sir, step back." And my mother tried, "We're her parents." And the officer said, "That doesn't matter." And I watched my father's jaw tighten because nothing enrages him more than a boundary he didn't approve. And then the deputy asked the signing agent for his file details, and the agent, bless him, handed over his phone and said, "The contact name on the order is Isla Carter." And Isla made a sound like she'd been punched, and she turned to my parents. "What did you do with my name?" And my father snapped, "Shut up." And the deputy's eyes narrowed, because shut up in front of law enforcement is never a good look. And I stood there in that hallway with the ocean smell faintly drifting in, and I realized something that hit me like a cold wave. This wasn't just about my condo anymore. This was about identity. It was about who they were willing to sacrifice. Because if they used Isla's name, they were willing to burn her too. And the deputy looked at me and said, "Ma'am, we're escalating this to the fraud unit formally." And my mother whispered, almost pleading, "Please, honey." And I looked at her, really looked, and thought about how she texted me a photo of my door with a new lock and called it securing. And I said, "You chose this." And the deputy told them to leave. And for once they had to. And as they walked away, my father looked back and mouthed something without sound, but I could read it. "You'll regret it." And Isla lingered for half a second, eyes wet, and whispered, "I'm sorry." And I didn't absolve her. I didn't attack her. I just said, "Tell me the truth later in writing." And then she was gone too, and the hallway quieted, and the deputy turned to me and said, "You did the right thing calling when they showed up again." And I nodded, and my phone buzzed with a new email from Seabright Compliance. Subject line, "Session. Artifacts retrieved," and I opened it. And my stomach dropped because attached was a still image pulled from the remote notarization session, and in the corner of the frame, reflected in a glass picture frame behind my mother, there was a third-person silhouette holding a phone like they were filming the signing, someone tall, unfamiliar, and my chest tightened because that meant my parents weren't just desperate, they were coordinated, and whoever that person was, they were close enough to stand in my parents' living room while my mother held up my stolen ID. And if you're watching right now, tell me this, what would you do if you realized your own parents didn't just betray you, they recruited help to do it? Because the next thing I did wasn't to cry or scream. It was to zoom in on that reflection until the pixels broke because I recognized the posture. And once I recognized who it was, the condo wasn't the only thing I was about to take back. I'm going to tell you something that sounds small until you've lived it. The moment you realize your parents didn't just lie to you, they built a team. Your whole nervous system changes, like your body stops waiting for love and starts preparing for war. And that's exactly what happened when I zoomed into that frozen frame from the remote notarization video and saw the reflection behind my mother's shoulder. Not my father, not my sister, but a third silhouette standing in their living room like a hired extra in a crime scene, tall, broad. Phone raised, filming, and my brain did that fast, ugly math. If there's a third person, there's planning. If there's planning, there's repetition. And if there's repetition, this condo was never the only target, and the ocean outside my balcony didn't sound soothing anymore. It sounded like static, like a giant hush trying to smother the truth. And I sat down hard on the couch and told myself, don't spiral, build a timeline, because spiraling is what they want. Spiraling makes you sloppy, and sloppy is where predators win. So I opened a note on my phone and typed the facts like bullets. Seabright Compliance retrieved session artifacts. Still image shows third person in reflection. Audio indicates off-camera instructions. Attempted deed of trust lists me as borrower. And then I typed the thing I didn't want to admit. My parents didn't do this alone. And as soon as I typed it, my phone buzzed again. Because of course it did. And it was a voicemail transcription from my mother that made my skin crawl. "Honey, You're scaring your father. We were trying to keep you safe. You don't understand how taxes work. You're going to get yourself sued. Please come talk like a family. And I laughed, one bitter little laugh, because listen, if you've ever been the child of people like this, you know the script. They commit the crime and then accuse you of causing the problem by noticing it. And I swear that's a special kind of evil, like punching you and then acting shocked you bled on their carpet. So I did the only thing that keeps me sane. I refused to enter their emotional courtroom. I stayed in the legal one. I forwarded the voicemail to my attorney, Tessa, with a subject line that said new gaslight audio. And then I opened the Seabright email again, and I stared at that still frame like it was a riddle. The reflection wasn't clear enough to name a face, but the posture, the stance, the way the person held the phone, that part triggered something in my memory because my father has a friend named Vic Harmon. And Vic is one of those men who always shows up wearing a polo shirt with a country club logo, always laughing too loud, always calling everyone kiddo, even when you're grown. And Vic is also the kind of guy who brags about knowing people at the courthouse like it's a party trick. And I remembered one Thanksgiving when he stood in our kitchen holding his phone up filming my mother carving pie while he said, "This is content. Marlena, people love a good family." And my mother laughed like she was a celebrity, and I remember thinking even then, why does he film everything? And that memory slammed into the present so hard I felt my throat tighten, because what if that silhouette was Vic? And if it was Vic, that meant my parents weren't just desperate. They were socially confident enough to involve someone outside the immediate family, which means they believed there would be no consequences, which means they've gotten away with things before. And here's the neurotic thought I'm not proud of, but I'm going to say it out loud because you deserve honesty. A part of me wanted to drive straight to my parents' house, walk in, grab every file drawer, and dump it in the street like confetti, because when someone steals your name, your body wants to take something back physically right now, but I didn't, because the grown-up version of revenge is restraint. It's letting them step deeper into the trap they dug themselves. So I took a breath, tasted the salt in the air, and I called Seabright Compliance back because I wanted more than a still image. I wanted every digital breadcrumb, and Angela, the compliance manager, answered like she hadn't slept, her voice calm, sharp, tired. "Miss Carter." And I said, "Angela, I need the full session metadata, device fingerprints, IP addresses, participant list, any secondary join link logs, everything." And she didn't argue. She said, "We've initiated preservation, but release requires subpoena or law enforcement request." And I said, "I have law enforcement involved, and my attorney is filing an emergency injunction." And Angela paused, the first human pause I'd heard from her all day, and she said quietly, "Off the record, you're doing exactly what people don't do soon enough." And I said, "They taught me early, if you hesitate, you lose." And then she said something that made my stomach twist. "The signing agent notes mention a facilitator present in the room, not just your parents." And I said, "A facilitator?" And she said, "Yes, someone guiding the process, pushing the ID toward the camera, correcting your mother's angle, telling your father when to speak." And my hands went cold, because that is not an accidental family misunderstanding. That is choreography. And I asked, "Do you have a name?" And she said, "Not in writing, but the agent described him as a family advisor." And I almost laughed, because my father loves titles like that. Family advisor, financial coach, estate consultant, anything that makes control sound like care. And I said, "Okay, Angela, I need the agent's direct contact, not to harass, to preserve testimony." And she said, "Send that request through your attorney and we'll coordinate with law enforcement." And then she lowered her voice. "Also, Ms. Carter, there's something else." And you know that feeling when someone says there's something else, and your spine tightens because your life is about to get bigger. She said, "We found another file connected to your name, not this property, another escrow intake. It didn't proceed, but it exists." And my chest thumped once, hard. "Another file where?" And she said, "Different county, different property type, but your name and old license were used again." And for a second, I couldn't speak, because I wasn't just fighting for a condo anymore, I was fighting for my identity. And that is a different kind of rage, because a condo is a building, but your identity is your life. It's your ability to rent, borrow, work, exist without being chased by paperwork you never signed. And I said, very carefully, "Send that to my attorney." And Angela said, "We will." And then my phone buzzed with a message from East Law, and I know you're going to want to jump on her. But listen, I'm going to tell you exactly how it felt. Her text wasn't manipulative, it was panicked. It said, "Brooke, I'm at my apartment. Dad keeps calling. I didn't authorize anything, I swear on everything. He said it was tax paperwork and he needed my name because you live out of state. What do I do? And I stared at it because my sister has never been forced to see my parents as dangerous. She's always been allowed to see them as helpful, and now the mask was slipping for her too. And here's where I need you watching to tell me what you would do. Would you comfort the sister who might be innocent? Or would you keep her at arm's length because she's been the golden excuse your whole life? Because I'll be honest, I wanted to do both. I wanted to hug her through the phone and also never trust her again, because betrayal doesn't just break trust with a betrayer, it poisons trust in the whole system. And I typed back, do not sign anything. Screenshot every call. Email me any documents. And if dad shows up, do not open the door. If you're scared, call the police. And she replied fast, he's saying you're unstable and the condo will bankrupt you. And I felt my mouth go dry because that line, unstable, is a weapon. It's the kind of word that's not meant to describe you. It's meant to discredit you, to make the world doubt your reality. And then I got another message, this time from my father, and he didn't even pretend to be sweet anymore. It read, last chance to be reasonable. That condo is going on the market. If you don't cooperate, you'll regret it. And I stared at the screen and felt something in me go very quiet, because threats don't scare you when you finally understand the person threatening you is already doing the worst thing they can. And I forwarded that text to Tessa too. And then I did the next practical thing. I ran my own credit report because I needed to see if there were new inquiries. And I'm telling you this not as a dramatic plot point, but as an actual life lesson. If anyone ever uses your ID, you check your credit immediately, you freeze it, and you set up alerts, because fraud isn't romantic, it's death by paperwork. And I logged in and saw an inquiry from a lender I didn't recognize, timestamped that morning, and I felt my stomach flip. They were shopping debt in my name like it was a handbag, and I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus. And then I took screenshots of the confirmation numbers, because you don't just do the action, you document the action. And right as I finished, a knock came. Not on my condo door, on my balcony sliding door. 3 taps, and my whole body jolted, because nobody knocks on a balcony door unless they're already inside the building. And I stepped back, heart pounding, and peeked through the blinds, and it was building security, not a stranger. A guard in a navy shirt with a radio, holding a small envelope, and he gestured for me to open. So I slid the door just enough. Chains still latched because I'm not stupid. And he said, Miss Carter, management asked me to deliver this to you directly. And he handed me the envelope, and I asked, what is it? And he said, a notice someone tried to add a lockbox again downstairs, and a visitor asked for access claiming he was your property representative, and my blood ran cold. Who? And the guard hesitated, then said, he gave the name Victor Harmon. And I swear my heart did that hard drop into my stomach, because my intuition hadn't been paranoid, it had been accurate. And I asked, did he get in? And the guard shook his head. No, we have the fraud hold on file, and the code was changed. He got angry, said he'd handle it legally. And I almost laughed, because of course he did. People like Vic always threaten legality as if the law is their personal assistant. And then the guard added, he left something, and he held up a printed card, glossy, with a logo that said Harmon Estate Advisory, and a tagline that made my skin crawl, protecting families through transitions. And I took it with 2 fingers like it was contaminated, and the guard said quietly, you want me to log this as harassment? And I said, yes, and I want the camera footage saved. And he nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to use the right words. I'll put in a preservation request. And when he left, I stood in my living room staring at that business card, and I felt the story click into a shape I didn't like, but finally understood. My parents weren't improvising. They were outsourcing. They found a man whose entire job is making controls sound like care, and they brought him in to paper over the theft with professionalism. And that meant my next step wasn't emotional, it was surgical. I needed Vic's fingerprints on the process. Not literal fingerprints, digital ones, emails, phone calls, instructions, because if he helped coordinate a fraudulent remote notarization, he wasn't just a family friend, he was an accomplice. And you know what the sickest part is? This is the kind of person who will still look you in the eyes and say, we did what was best for you. Like, theft is a parenting technique. So I called Deputy Miles, told him Vic had attempted access, gave the guard's report, and Miles' tone changed from supportive to alert. Stay inside, he said. We're going to add this name to the report. And then he said, your attorney should seek and order restraining contact and access attempts. And I said, she already is. And I hung up and immediately called Tessa and said, "It's Vic Harmon." And she went silent for half a beat, the kind of silence that means her mind is moving fast. And then she said, "Good, a third party makes this easier to prove as coordinated fraud." And I said, "Easier?" And she said, "Because parents can claim misunderstanding, advisors can't." And then she told me to do something that felt like a power move and also a protective move. "We're going to send Vic a preservation letter," she said. In plain language, do not destroy, delete, or alter any communications related to Brooke Carter, Seaside Villas, Unit 9B, Seabright Title, remote notarization, or any deed of trust, because litigation and criminal investigation are reasonably anticipated. And I said, "Send it." And she said, "I already drafted it, sign and return." And I did. And as soon as I sent it back, another email came in from Seabright, subject line, "Preliminary review findings," and my chest tightened before I even opened it. And when I did, there it was in black and white, the facilitator's email used to coordinate the session, a Gmail address with the name Vic Harmon Advisory in it. And the message thread showed him instructing the notary on timing, telling my mother to have the ID ready, telling my father to stay off camera, and my skin went icy hot because now it wasn't suspicion, it was proof. And I thought, this is the moment where they stop being my parents in the eyes of the system and start being perpetrators. And that thought didn't make me sad, it made me calm, because calm is what happens when confusion dies. And then my phone rang, a known number again, and I answered, and a woman's voice said, "Ms. Carter, this is the Marina office. We're calling about a slip associated with Daniel Carter. There's an outstanding balance, and he listed you as an emergency contact." And I blinked, because my father had the nerve to involve my name in yet another financial mess while committing fraud against me. And I said, "Remove my name immediately. I am not authorized on any of his accounts." And the woman apologized, and I hung up, and I just stood there for a second, letting the irony burn. They call me unstable while attaching my name to their liabilities like a flotation device. And that's when it hit me. The condo was their cash grab, but the bigger game was always the same: leverage. They wanted to keep me in a position where my name is entangled with theirs, so I can't ever fully leave, because leaving is the one thing they can't control. And I want you to hear this moral lesson tucked inside all the drama. Sometimes the inheritance isn't money, it's a pattern, and the only way you break it is by refusing the role they assigned you. So I sat down, opened a fresh page in my document, and wrote my next moves like a checklist: restraining order, quiet title filing, subpoena remote notarization platform, subpoena Seabright logs, request building footage, freeze credit, notify HOA, notify insurer, notify IRS identity protection PIN. And then I paused and wrote one more line in all caps: and oh, private conversations, because private conversations are where they rewrite history and make you doubt yourself. And right as I finished, a final email came in from Tessa with a subject line, "Emergency hearing set." And my stomach dropped, because an emergency hearing means the court is moving fast. And fast courts usually mean the evidence is bad. And when I opened it, I saw the date, tomorrow morning, and I felt my breath catch, because tomorrow morning I wouldn't be fighting my parents in a hallway, I'd be fighting them in front of a judge. And judges don't care about family loyalty speeches, they care about documents, and I had documents, and my parents had lies. And as I looked at the hearing notice, my phone buzzed one more time, and this time it was a photo from Isla, shaky, taken through her peephole, and on the other side of her door stood my father and Vic Harmon together, close, whispering, holding a folder. And Isla texted, "They're here, and Vic is telling Dad to make me sign." And then my heart started pounding so hard it felt like it was knocking on my ribs, because if they were at Isla's door tonight, the night before court, that meant they weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to force a signature the old way: pressure, fear, family shame. And I typed back, "Do not open, call 911, say attempted coercion tied to active fraud case." And then I called Deputy Miles again. And as the phone rang, one ugly thought crawled through my mind. The thought that made my hands shake for the first time all day. What if tomorrow isn't the first time a judge hears my father's name in a fraud report? What if he's done this before? And if he has, what else did he steal? And from who? And that question is exactly what the next document in my inbox answered when Tessa forwarded me a discovery note that simply said, "You need to sit down before you read this." Because it wasn't just the condo, and it wasn't just my name, it was the signature pattern across multiple filings. And the system finally recognized it as one person's habit. The next morning didn't feel like a dramatic movie morning. It felt like the kind of morning where your body is awake before your brain is, where the ocean outside is still doing its peaceful little performance while your stomach is doing cartwheels, and I remember standing in my condo kitchen staring at my coffee, like it was going to give me instructions. And then I heard the elevator ding down the hall, and my hands went cold because my brain still had that reflex. Footsteps equals them, so I checked my phone, read the time again, and told myself, no, you're going to court, not to a family meeting, and that distinction is everything, because family meetings are where they control the air, court is where the air controls them. And when I walked into the courthouse, it smelled like old paper and disinfectant and that weird, tense quiet people get when they've got something to lose. And I had my folder pressed flat against my ribs like I was carrying a second spine, and in the hallway, outside the courtroom, I saw them. My father in his expensive watch and his tight smile. My mother with her hair perfect, like she thought appearance could erase evidence, and right beside them, Vic Harmon, polo shirt, glossy folder. The same man who tried to get into my building, standing there like he belonged. And the sick part is he waved at me like we were at a brunch, like he hadn't just coordinated a fraud attempt against my name. And I swear to you, my first instinct was to laugh, because when someone thinks they can steal from you and still act friendly, they're not just immoral, they're delusional. And then I saw Isla behind them for half a second, not standing with them, standing near the vending machine like she didn't know where to put her body. And when our eyes met, she looked like a person who had just realized the family story she grew up with was a costume. And my father noticed me looking at her and immediately stepped to block my line of sight like she was an object he could reposition, and that tiny moment told me the truth. He wasn't trying to win the condo. He was trying to win control of the narrative and control of her. And I'm not going to pretend I'm some saint, because I had a nasty little thought right there. I thought, I hope the judge sees him the way I've seen him my whole life. Not as a concerned dad, but as a man who treats people like paperwork. And then Tessa arrived, calm as ice. No theatrics, no gossip, just a woman who has read enough fraud cases to know exactly what arrogance smells like. And she nodded at me and whispered, no emotions, only exhibits. And I nodded because emotions are what my parents are good at weaponizing. Exhibits are what they can't flirt with. And then we walked into the courtroom and sat down, and the judge came in, older, tired eyes, the kind of person who has heard every excuse in the book and still shows up because the law is the only thing that keeps people like my father from turning the world into their personal playground. And the judge asked for appearances, and my father's attorney stood and did the whole polished introduction. And then Tessa stood and said, Your Honor, we are here on an emergency motion for injunctive relief and a petition to quiet title due to a forged quitclaim deed and an attempted deed of trust submitted in my client's name, with remote notarization artifacts preserved by the title company. And I watched my mother's face twitch at the words forged and artifacts, like she didn't expect the language to be so clinical, because clinical language doesn't care about her tears. And the judge looked down at the papers and said, Ms. Carter, you are the petitioner. And I said, Yes, Your Honor. And my voice didn't shake, not because I wasn't furious, but because I'd already spent all my shaking energy surviving them. And then the judge asked my father, Mr. Carter, did you record a deed transferring this property from your daughter to you? And my father did what he always does when he's cornered. He tried to make it about my character. He said, Your Honor, my daughter has been confused and emotional since my father passed, and we were trying to help manage the tax liability and the HOA obligations. She doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with ownership. And I swear I saw the judge's eyes narrow, because judges hate when people answer a yes or no question with a biography. And Tessa didn't even let him finish. She said, Your Honor, may I approach with Exhibit A? And the judge nodded, and Tessa placed the forged deed printout on the stand along with the county fraud hold confirmation. And then she placed the Seabright compliance email, and then she placed the still image from the remote notarization session and the e-recording metadata. And I watched my father's smile tighten as the paper piled up, because he's a man who loves paper when it's helping him. But paper is terrifying when it's telling on him. And then Tessa said, Your Honor, the county records supervisor can attest the deed was submitted via e-recording under an account authorized under Ms. Carter's sister's identity, and the attempted deed of trust lists Ms. Carter as borrower, which would have saddled her with a lien, and the title company has preserved video and IP logs showing a facilitator present. And the judge looked straight at Vic for the first time and said, And who is that? And Vic stood up smoothly, like he'd practiced in the mirror. Victor Harmon, Your Honor, I am a family advisor. And the judge said, You're not counsel. And Vic smiled. No, Your Honor. And then the judge said, Then you do not speak unless asked. And Vic sat down so fast it was almost funny, because the courtroom is one place where his little charm badge doesn't work. And my father tried to interrupt, and the judge held up a hand and said, You will not speak over counsel. And I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in days. Not joy, just relief, because the rules were finally being enforced. And then Tessa did the most satisfying thing I've ever seen done with a calm voice. She asked permission to play a portion of the remote notarization video, just a short compliant clip. And the judge allowed it, and the courtroom heard my father's voice. Off camera, low and controlling. Hold it closer, Marlena. Show the ID, angle it. Don't talk unless he asks. And my mother's voice nervous. Is this okay? And then Vic's voice crisp. Yes, just follow the steps, we're almost done. And the signing agent's voice uneasy. I'm seeing inconsistencies. I need the signer to respond. And my father's voice again, sharper. She's busy. Just proceed. And the judge stopped it right there. He didn't need the whole thing. He had enough, and he looked at my father and said, Mr. Carter, that is not helping with taxes. That is an attempt to execute a transfer without the grantor's participation. And my father's face went red, and then my mother started crying, the soft social crying she uses to blur lines. And the judge didn't even flinch. He said, Ma'am, stop. And she actually stopped, like the tears froze in her eyes. Because in that room her tears weren't currency. And then the judge asked me one question that hit harder than anything else. He asked, Ms. Carter, did you sign this deed? And I said, No, Your Honor, I did not. And I was not present on any remote notarization call. I have work records, time-stamped calendar logs, and the county and title company have already placed holds due to suspected fraud. And then the judge turned to my father's attorney and said, Counsel, do you have any good faith basis to argue this deed is valid? And the attorney hesitated, because what do you say when the video literally shows your client coaching a notary fraud attempt, and he tried to pivot? Your Honor, even if there were procedural irregularities, this is a family dispute better handled privately. And the judge said, This is not a family dispute. This is a property and identity dispute, and potentially criminal. And I swear if you could bottle the look on my father's face in that moment, it would be labeled panic. Because the one thing he never planned for was the system treating him the way he treats other people, as a line item. And then the judge issued the order right there. Temporary restraining order barring my parents and any agents from contacting me about the condo, barring them from approaching the property, ordering them to surrender any keys, access codes, or lockbox information, and ordering immediate notice to any escrow or signing services associated with the attempted sale. And then the judge looked at Vic and said, Mr. Harmon, you are ordered to preserve all records related to this transaction, and you are not to contact Ms. Carter. Any violation will be referred. And Vic's face went stiff, because he finally realized he wasn't just a helpful friend. He was a name on a judge's radar. And then the judge said the line that made my knees almost buckle. The last valid deed in the chain is the grandfather's deed to Ms. Carter, and absent evidence to the contrary, the court recognizes her as the proper title holder pending final adjudication. And I exhaled so hard it felt like my lungs were dumping months of stored tension. And here's the thing, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like getting your name back. And when we walked out into the hallway, my father tried one last play. He stepped toward me with that fake soft voice. Brooke, you're destroying your family. And Tessa stepped in front of me, not touching him, just occupying space, and she said, Sir, do not speak to my client. And my father looked at Isla like she was supposed to rescue him. And Isla did something that will probably be the quietest plot twist in this whole story. She stepped back, not toward him, away from him, and she whispered, Don't. And my father's eyes widened like he'd been slapped, because the golden child was finally saying no. And my mother opened her mouth to cry again, and Isla said, Mom, stop. And it was like watching someone flip a breaker in a house that's been flickering for years. And my parents walked away, not defeated with drama, defeated with paperwork, and I'm going to tell you the aftermath because people love the courtroom moment, but real consequences happen in the boring hours after. We went straight to the sheriff's office. Deputy Miles took the judge's order, added it to the incident report, and filed a preservation request to Seabright and the remote notarization platform, and then we sent the order to building management. And the HOA sent a written trespass notice to my parents and Vic, and within 2 hours, the property manager texted me a photo of the lockbox bin where the old lockbox sat like garbage, and then Seabright Compliance emailed again, file permanently closed, fraud confirmed, reported to authorities, and then, the sweetest small thing, my phone stopped buzzing because when you put the system between you and manipulators, they lose access to your nervous system, and that night I sat on my balcony, the ocean doing its steady breath in and out, and I thought about my grandfather, not about the money. About the intention. He tried to give me something that could stand outside my parents' reach, and for a minute it almost didn't, but the point is it did because I stopped treating their behavior like family stuff and started treating it like what it was, attempted theft. And here's the moral lesson I want you to keep, especially if you're the reasonable one in your family, the one who gets told to keep peace. Peace without protection is just permission, and if you've ever had someone use love as a leash, you know exactly what I mean, and I need you in the comments on this one because this is where the internet gets loud. Do you think I should have confronted them privately first, or do you think going straight to the records office and law enforcement was the only smart move? And be honest, if your parents forged your name to steal your inheritance, would you still believe in family loyalty? Or would you treat it like any other crime? And also, if you've ever had a parent use the line "your sister needs it" or "your brother needs it" to justify taking from you, tell me what they took, because I promise you're not the only one. And before you click off, I want to point you to the next story you need to watch because it's the perfect companion to this one. It's about a woman whose parents refused a small amount to save her leg, and then she discovered they were drowning in debt while pretending to be wealthy. And what she did next will make you rethink the word consequences, because the real theme here isn't money. It's the moment the underestimated stops playing nice and starts playing accurate. And if that sentence just hit you in the chest, go watch that next one and come back here after, because I want to know which kind of betrayal you think is worse, stealing your body's future or stealing your name and your home. And if you want more stories like this, not just drama but actual tactics, how to document, how to lock down your identity, how to stop a fraud attempt in real time, subscribe and share this with someone who's been told to be the bigger person while being robbed, because being the bigger person is cute until you're paying for a debt you never agreed to, and I'm not interested in cute anymore.